The Cadillac gleamed in the courthouse parking lot that morning, black as polished obsidian, every chrome edge catching the October sun like a declaration. Daniel saw it before he saw me, and from the way he stopped walking, I knew he understood this day was never going to end the way he had imagined. For months he had told relatives I was confused, too old to manage alone, too fragile to make financial decisions, and Vanessa had helped spread those whispers through church circles, neighborhood luncheons, even among my late husband's old friends. They had nearly turned concern into a weapon. Nearly. But people who mistake patience for weakness usually miss the moment the tide has already turned. Inside the probate hearing, the judge reviewed the petition Daniel had filed seeking emergency conservatorship over my finances, using that little story about taking my car keys for safety as proof I was no longer competent. What Daniel did not know was that the week I drove home in that new Cadillac, I had also driven straight to Margaret Cole's office and restructured everything. The family trust was amended. The house was protected. My investments were placed under independent fiduciary oversight. And every email, every voicemail, every text where Vanessa discussed listing my home before I was ready for assisted living, every conversation Daniel had with the elder care broker who assumed I knew nothing, had been preserved. When Margaret placed those records into evidence, the room went so quiet I could hear the air vent humming. The judge looked over her glasses at my son and asked the question that broke him. Were you protecting your mother or positioning yourself to control her assets? Daniel had no answer. Vanessa's face drained white. Their petition was dismissed in under 20 minutes. But dismissal was only the beginning. Because when the court ruled their filing had been made in bad faith and based on material misrepresentation, they were ordered to pay legal fees. Daniel's firm, already under pressure, had to disclose the sanction to partners. He lost his bid for managing director 3 weeks later. Vanessa's charity board quietly asked for her resignation after donors learned she had tried to force an elderly woman into guardianship while discussing liquidation of her home. In a town like ours, reputations do not explode. They erode. Publicly. Permanently. But the moment that satisfied me most did not happen in court. It happened when we stepped outside. Daniel followed me down the courthouse steps, voice shaking, asking how I could do this to my own son. I turned and looked at him the way mothers do when they finally stop seeing the child and start seeing the man. You tried to take my keys, I told him, but what you really wanted was my authority. He began to say he was only worried about me. I held up my hand. Concern doesn't file false petitions. Concern doesn't price a mother's house before asking whether she wants to leave it. Vanessa would not meet my eyes. For the first time since she entered this family, she had nothing polished enough to hide behind. I handed Daniel a single envelope. Inside was a notarized copy of the new trust. My estate would fund scholarships in my husband's name, gifts for my grandchildren, and charitable endowments I chose myself. Daniel's direct control over everything he thought he was inheriting had been reduced to one symbolic dollar. Legal. Final. Intentional. He looked up at me stunned. $1, he whispered. That, I said, is what entitlement is worth. Then I walked to my Cadillac. Brand new. Paid in full. Mine. I remember settling into the leather seat, pressing the ignition, hearing that quiet, powerful engine turn over, and feeling something larger than victory move through me. It was restoration. Daniel stood there in the rear view, mirror growing smaller as I backed out. For months he had acted as though age meant surrender. But age had taught me leverage, not helplessness. I drove west that afternoon with the windows cracked just enough for autumn air to move through the cabin, down Route 41 toward the lake where my husband and I used to picnic. 63 miles of open road, gold leaves along the shoulders, sunlight flashing across the hood ornament. Freedom measured in miles per hour. When I stopped at a scenic overlook, a woman about my age admired the car and asked if my husband had bought it for me. I smiled and said, no. I bought it after my son tried to decide my life for me. She laughed so hard, she nearly spilled her coffee. That laugh stayed with me, because it sounded like release. Daniel called twice in the weeks that followed. I did not block him. I simply stopped rescuing him from the consequences of who he had become. That was punishment enough. And the final irony? The keys he once took for safety still hang by my kitchen door, untouched beside the Cadillac fob. Sometimes when I pass them, I think how small a betrayal can look in the beginning. A son pockets a set of keys. A mother says nothing. And then one day, she buys a Cadillac, saves her home, destroys a false guardianship case, strips greed of its inheritance, and drives away with every ounce of power restored. They thought taking my car keys would make me dependent. Instead, it reminded me I was still capable of taking the wheel. Mom, I'm taking your car keys. At your age, driving isn't safe anymore. My son said it so casually over Sunday pot roast you would have thought he was passing the salt. I looked at the brass key ring in his hand and smiled, because in that moment I understood something he did not. People only try to take control when they believe you have already surrendered it. Daniel had arrived late that afternoon with Vanessa, carrying a peach pie from the bakery I used to love before sugar became something doctors warned me about. The house still held the quiet dignity my husband Arthur built into it. Walnut shelves lined with old biographies, the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, sunlight warming the kitchen tile the same way it had for 30 years. At 68, I still drove myself to church every Wednesday, to the grocer every Friday, and once a month I made the 42-mile drive to Arthur's grave with fresh chrysanthemums. My old Buick was not glamorous, but it represented something larger than transportation. It meant no one had to grant me permission to live my life. During dinner, Daniel kept exchanging little glances with Vanessa, those quick, silent looks married people use when they think no one notices. I noticed. I always notice. He asked whether I had considered moving closer to them. Vanessa mentioned a wonderful senior community her friend's mother had moved into. Their words floated through the room dressed as concern, but there was a weight beneath them that settled in my chest. I had heard that tone before, years ago when Arthur's brother tried to convince us to sell the lake cabin for convenience. Convenience is often greed wearing perfume. When I stood to clear the plates, Daniel followed me into the kitchen and reached for the keys hanging beside the pantry door. He turned them in his palm, almost absent-mindedly. "Mom," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing a burden, "Vanessa and I have been talking. We worry about you driving alone." I let the dish towel rest in my hands. "Do you?" I asked. He nodded. "You missed the turn to our house last month." I almost laughed. The road was closed for construction, but he had already built a story where I was slipping. "I'm keeping these for now," he said. "For safety." For a moment, all I heard was the refrigerator humming. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, too quickly, as if she had been listening. Her smile was gentle enough to seem kind to anyone passing through. "It's for the best," she said. I looked at my son, this man I had once taught to ride a bicycle in our driveway, and saw not cruelty exactly, but something colder. Assumption. He believed I would accept being managed. I dried my hands, folded the towel, and said only, "If that makes you feel better." Daniel seemed relieved by my calm. That was his first mistake. Because later that night, when the house had gone still and moonlight silvered the kitchen floor, I stood before the empty hook where my keys had hung and felt not grief, not humiliation, but clarity. This was not about driving. This was a test of who still held authority over my life. And before the week was over, I would make sure my son understood the answer. The next morning I made coffee before dawn and sat at the kitchen table while the house held that sacred hour of silence before the world begins making demands. Arthur used to call it honest time. The clock ticked. The maple outside the window shed yellow leaves onto the driveway, where my Buick sat exactly where I had parked it, except now it might as well have been a mile away. I wrapped both hands around the mug and replayed every word Daniel had said. Not because I doubted what happened, but because tone reveals what words try to hide. He had not asked whether I needed help. He had announced a decision already made. That difference mattered. By 9 o'clock, I was in the hallway closet pulling down an old shoebox of papers Arthur used to call our life archive. Insurance policies, tax records, property deeds, handwritten notes tucked inside folders for reasons only he understood. I was not looking for anything in particular at first. I only felt the need to remind myself what belonged to me before someone else tried defining it. Then I found something that made me stop. A brochure folded into thirds. Cedar Pines Senior Living. I had never seen it before. My fingers went cold. It had Daniel's handwriting on the back. Tour Thursday at 2. Ask about independent cottage availability. I sat down very slowly. There are moments when suspicion becomes shape. This was one. I remembered Vanessa mentioning senior communities over lemon bars last Easter. I remembered Daniel casually asking whether I still balanced my own accounts. At the time, each thing had seemed harmless. Separate puzzle pieces. Now edges began touching. Around noon I drove nowhere because I had no keys, but habit carried me to the porch where I usually left for errands. I stood there looking down the street while Mrs. Hanley watered Mums next door. She waved and asked if I was heading to town. Not today, I said. The words tasted strange. Not today. As though permission had become external. That afternoon the phone rang. It was Vanessa, voice sweet as glaze. She said she had found a lovely pamphlet for a retirement community with gardening clubs and shuttle service. Just options, she chirped. No pressure. I let her speak until the rehearsed concern exhausted itself. Then I said, Tell me, Vanessa, when exactly did you and Daniel begin discussing where I should live? Silence. Just long enough. We only want what is best for you, she answered. People say that when they want what is easiest for themselves. After we hung up, I opened Arthur's old desk for the first time in months. In the bottom drawer was the leather address book where he kept everyone important. Lawyers, bankers, contractors, names written in his careful block letters. My finger stopped on Margaret Cole, estate attorney, retired, though Arthur always said retirement for Margaret meant charging less. I stared at the number for a long time. Calling would mean admitting this was no misunderstanding. It was conflict, but doing nothing would be agreement disguised as politeness. At 4:30, I dialed. Margaret answered on the second ring, older voice, same steel beneath it. I told her only that my son had taken my keys, and I had found a senior living brochure in my house. She was quiet a moment, then said, Helen, do not sign anything. And tomorrow, wear something respectable. We are going somewhere. Where? I asked. I heard a smile in her voice. To remind certain people you are not finished driving your own story. That night, I slept poorly, though not from fear. Something had shifted. The loneliness I felt after Daniel left had hardened into purpose. Before turning off the lamp, I looked once more at the empty hook beside the pantry. And for the first time, I did not see something taken from me. I saw bait. Margaret arrived at 10 the next morning in a navy sedan older than my Buick and somehow carrying twice the authority. She wore pearl earrings, a camel coat, and the expression of a woman who had spent 40 years watching families confuse inheritance with entitlement. She did not waste words. Bring your checkbook, she said. And wear the good shoes. During the drive into town, she asked almost nothing, which I appreciated. People who truly understand crisis do not crowd it with sympathy. They give it room to reveal itself. We passed the courthouse square, the diner where Arthur and I once shared pie on Thursdays, the hardware store Daniel loved as a boy. Every familiar landmark seemed sharpened by a strange new awareness, as though my life was being shown back to me with hidden markings I had missed. Margaret parked, but not near her office. Instead, she stopped in front of Whitmore Cadillac. I looked at the sign, then at her. I thought we were reviewing estate documents. She folded her gloves into her purse. We are. But first we are restoring context. Inside the showroom, the air smelled faintly of leather and polished floors. Sunlight poured across chrome. A silver sedan sat on the platform, turning slowly, as if displaying not a car but an argument. I almost laughed. Margaret, I came here without my keys. She looked at me deadpan. Exactly. A salesman approached, too young to know whether to treat older women as serious buyers or window shoppers. Margaret handled him with surgical calm. Within minutes we were seated in a new Cadillac, black exterior, cream interior, the kind Arthur would have called excessive before secretly admiring it. My hand rested on the steering wheel, and something old stirred awake. not vanity. Recognition. I had not realized how deeply Daniel taking those keys had tried to reduce me until I sat there feeling scale return. Margaret leaned toward me and lowered her voice. Control survives by convincing you resistance is impolite. I looked at her. And this is resistance?
No, she said.
This is evidence. We spent an hour discussing numbers. I could afford the car without touching long-term reserves. That mattered less than what came next. At Margaret's office, over yellow legal pads and cooling coffee, she asked questions no one had yet asked. Had Daniel ever requested account access? Had I signed powers of attorney? Had Vanessa suggested moving assets? Each answer widened something in Margaret's expression. Not surprise exactly, but confirmation. Then she slid a folder toward me. Draft amendments to my trust. Independent fiduciary oversight. Contingency clauses against coercive guardianship petitions. I read slowly. The language was cold and beautiful. Protection written in sentences. Do you think my son would really try legal control? I asked. Margaret removed her glasses. Helen, he already tested whether you would surrender it voluntarily. I signed where she indicated. My hand did not tremble. When we left, the dealership had detailed the Cadillac and parked it by the curb, a black ribbon tied across the hood for effect. I almost refused the theatrics until I imagined Daniel's face seeing it in my driveway. Then I kept the ribbon. The drive home was only 14 miles, but felt larger. The engine moved with effortless confidence. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw not a frightened widow defending scraps of independence, but the woman Arthur once called impossible to corner. Yet the true revelation came when I turned onto my street and saw Daniel's SUV parked outside my house. He was on the porch with Vanessa, both carrying grocery bags as though performing concern for an audience. I slowed, pulled into the driveway, and let the Cadillac settle into silence. Neither of them moved at first. They simply stared. Vanessa's smile froze. Daniel looked as if the world had tilted 6 degrees. I stepped out, closed the door gently, and touched the hood once, almost like greeting an accomplice. Daniel found his voice. Mom, what is this? I met his eyes. Transportation, I said. And Daniel? He swallowed. Yes. I smiled the same way I had when he took my keys. You should probably give me mine back now. We are going to need them. Daniel stood frozen long enough for the silence to become its own kind of verdict. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out my old key ring, the brass one with the worn church charm Arthur once gave me at Christmas. He held it out almost sheepishly, but I did not take it.
Keep them, I said.
You seemed so determined to save me from myself. Vanessa gave a strained little laugh, the kind people use when panic has not yet found words. They followed me into the kitchen carrying groceries no one had asked them to bring. Fruit, soup, prepared casseroles. Offerings arranged to resemble devotion. I set water to boil for tea and watched their reflections in the dark window over the sink. Daniel kept glancing toward the driveway where the Cadillac sat visible through the curtains like an accusation with chrome trim. Mom, he began carefully, this is a big purchase. I turned. So is a retirement. Facility deposit. His face changed before he could stop it. There are expressions so brief they only appear when truth is caught undressed. Vanessa recovered first. I think there is some misunderstanding. No, I said softly. I think there was. We sat at the table where Arthur once balanced checkbooks every April. The same oak surface where Daniel did homework as a boy. Strange how betrayal often chooses sentimental furniture. Daniel leaned forward, palms open in that practiced posture of reasonableness. He said he had only worried after my missed turn months ago. He said the Cedar Pines brochure was exploratory. He said they had discussed options, nothing more. Every sentence was technically gentle and morally dishonest. I let him finish. Then I asked the one question he had not prepared for. When were you going to tell me you tore the cottages? His mouth parted. No answer. Vanessa looked down at her tea. That was when I understood something essential. They had expected resistance perhaps, tears maybe, but not evidence. I rose and went to Arthur's desk, returning with a slim manila folder. Inside were copies of amended trust papers, not for them to read in full, only enough to let the shape of events become visible. Daniel scanned the first page and frowned. Independent fiduciary oversight, he read. Why would you do this? Because, I said, the moment family begins discussing capacity behind closed doors, prudence becomes self-respect. He flushed. You went to a lawyer because I took your keys? No, I said. I went because you thought taking them entitled you to more. Vanessa tried a different tactic then, voice damp with injured innocence. She said I was punishing concern. I almost admired the attempt. Concern does not arrive with housing brochures hidden in my closet, I said. Concern does not test whether a widow will quietly surrender property decisions. The room cooled. Outside, a gust moved leaves across the driveway around the Cadillac's tires. Daniel stared at the trust papers a long while. What else have you changed? He asked finally. Enough, I said. And that frightened him more than anger would have. Before leaving, he asked whether we could all sit down Sunday and talk through misunderstandings. I agreed too easily, which unsettled Vanessa. As they gathered their coats, Daniel paused by the pantry where the empty hook still hung. Do you want these back now? He asked, lifting the old keyring again. This time I took it and set it beside the new Cadillac fob. Old authority beside new leverage. 2 kinds of keys. 2 eras. After they left, Margaret called to ask how the debut had gone. They looked shocked, I said. She laughed softly. Good. Shock creates mistakes. Then she told me something that kept me awake half the night. A preliminary guardianship inquiry had been logged 2 weeks earlier by someone using Daniel's firm address as contact reference. Not filed formally. Just tested.
A probe.
My fingers tightened around the phone. So, I had not imagined the edge beneath their concern. It was already moving toward paperwork. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room listening to the clock. Sunday lunch was no longer family repair. It was a stage. And for the first time since Arthur died, I felt something almost dangerous rising under my calm. Anticipation. Sunday arrived cold and bright, one of those late autumn mornings when light looks honest enough to expose whatever people hoped would remain blurred. I rose early and made pot roast the way Arthur liked, with carrots cut thick and rosemary tucked beneath the roast. Not because I intended comfort, but because ritual steadies the hand before decisive moments. By noon the table was set with the good china. Daniel arrived carrying wine. Vanessa brought a pecan pie from the bakery, smiling too carefully. They were overdressed for lunch. That alone told me they had come prepared for negotiation. We spoke first of harmless things. Weather. Church repairs. A neighbor selling his farm equipment. Yet underneath every sentence lay the tautness of people circling what matters. Halfway through the meal, Daniel set down his fork and folded his hands. Mom, we need to talk openly. I almost admired how much gravity he tried to borrow from sincerity. He said he feared I was isolating. Vanessa mentioned accidents involving older drivers she had read about. Then Daniel slid an envelope across the table. Just information, he said. Inside was a draft proposal from an elder care consultant outlining assisted living assessments and financial transition planning. There it was. No longer hinted.
Written. Costed. Sequenced.
They had come to stage concern as inevitability. I read every page, without rushing. Then I laid the packet beside my plate and dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin. Before we continue, I said, I have something for you as well. From Arthur's old briefcase by my chair, I removed a small digital recorder and set it on the table. Neither moved. This records automatically when voices rise above a threshold, I said mildly. Useful feature. Vanessa paled. Daniel stared. I let silence ripen. Interesting thing about people planning your future, I continued, they often speak too freely when they assume you are not listening. I did not need to play anything. The possibility alone altered the room. Daniel tried indignation. Asked whether I had been spying on my own family. No, I said. I've been documenting pressure. Then I handed him another envelope. This one held notice that my home had been transferred into a protected trust with independent oversight and anti-coercion provisions. Daniel read the pages twice. "You cut us out?" he asked. "I removed opportunity for manipulation," I said. Vanessa's voice sharpened despite herself. She asked whether I really believed they were after my money. I looked at her steadily. "You priced my house before asking whether I wanted to leave it." Her lips parted, then closed. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Cadillac in the drive. For a moment, he looked less like a strategist and more like a boy who had misjudged the strength of a door he pushed. When he turned back, his tone had changed. "Harder now." He said if I was making irrational financial moves, he might have no choice but pursue formal protections. There it was at last. The threat beneath concern stepping fully into daylight. Instead of reacting, I reached for the gravy boat and asked if anyone wanted more. Even Daniel looked unsettled by my calm. After dessert, they left earlier than planned. At the door, Daniel said we were making this adversarial when it did not have to be.
No, iyan suara.
You made it adversarial when you confused guardianship with obedience. After their car disappeared, I called Margaret and told her everything. She was quiet, then said, "Good." He showed his hand. The next morning, a certified letter arrived from Daniel's attorney requesting evaluation records and proposing emergency conservatorship discussions. It had begun.
Formal now.
Legal. Predictable. I set the letter beside my coffee cup and did not flinch, because fear thrives on surprise, and surprise had ended. By afternoon, Margaret and I were at the courthouse filing our response. As we left, she asked whether I regretted escalating. I looked across the parking lot at my reflection in the Cadillac's dark finish. "No," I said. "I regret only that my son mistook kindness for surrender." Then I noticed, across the street near the courthouse steps, Vanessa speaking urgently to a man in a gray suit I did not recognize. He handed her a folder. She tucked it under her coat, and when she saw me watching, she froze. Some betrayals reveal themselves in arguments, others in glances. I knew then Sunday lunch had not been their full plan. It had only been rehearsal. Margaret did not seem surprised when I told her about the man in the gray suit. She only asked whether I recognized the law firm embossed on the folder. I had not. By Tuesday morning, she had found out. Elder advocacy litigation specialists. The kind families hire when they intend to dress control in procedural respectability. "They are moving faster than I expected," she said over coffee in her office. "Which means they are nervous. Nervous people make errors." That sentence stayed with me all day. We began assembling what Margaret called a record of competence, though the phrase amused me. At 68, I had balanced a household, managed investments with Arthur, paid property taxes on time for decades, and somehow now needed documentation proving I could choose my own breakfast. Still, we built the record. Medical evaluations showing no cognitive decline. Driving assessments.
Bank
Statements. Community references. Even Father Nolan wrote a letter noting I chaired the church scholarship committee and still corrected his arithmetic. By Thursday, a hearing date was set. 2 weeks. Daniel was seeking temporary conservatorship pending review. I read the petition once and felt a curious stillness rather than outrage. His affidavit described concern over financial impulsivity, citing the Cadillac purchase as evidence. I laughed aloud at that. To think a car chosen with cash and legal counsel had become recklessness, while plotting a mother's housing transfer counted as care. That evening Daniel called. His voice sounded worn. He asked whether we might settle this privately. I asked whether withdrawing the petition was part of his definition of private. He did not answer. Instead, he said Vanessa had become overwhelmed, that matters had gone farther than intended. That phrase again. As though outcomes simply wander off unattended. "Daniel," I said, "did you file because you feared for me, or because I stopped cooperating?" The silence lasted long enough to tell the truth. On Saturday, Margaret insisted I attend the county antique auto fair with her, of all things. I almost refused until she said strategy sometimes requires looking untroubled in public. We walked rows of restored classics under striped tents while collectors debated engines and paint codes. And there, Beside a 1964 Coupe de Ville stood the man in the gray suit. He recognized me instantly and approached with the polished caution of someone uncertain whether he had been seen doing something compromising. He introduced himself as Gregory Ames, consultant. Not attorney, consultant. A distinction too deliberate to trust. He said he hoped matters with my family resolved compassionately. I smiled and asked whether compassion often bills by the hour. Margaret nearly choked, suppressing laughter. But the true gift came moments later when Gregory, believing perhaps he could reassure me, mentioned Vanessa had been particularly worried after discussing liquidity concerns tied to Daniel's firm. Liquidity concerns. I repeated the phrase later in the car until its shape hardened. This was not only about my age. Something financial pressed behind the urgency. Monday, Margaret confirmed it. Daniel's firm had suffered partnership losses after a failed commercial development. Personal guarantees may have exposed him. My house had not merely represented convenience. It had represented collateral. When I heard that, grief arrived sharper than anger. Because greed from strangers is ordinary. From a son, it feels almost archaeological, as though something buried ugly has surfaced through blood. Yet sorrow did not weaken me. It clarified scale. At the pre-hearing conference, Daniel's counsel pushed for immediate oversight due to undue influence by outside parties, meaning Margaret. The judge asked whether there was evidence I had been coerced. Margaret slid forward a packet thicker than a city directory. Medicals, trust documents, property history. Then, almost casually, she introduced records showing inquiries into leveraging home equity had been made months earlier through a contact linked to Daniel's office. I watched his lawyer's expression shift. Tiny movements tell large stories. Outside the courtroom, Daniel caught up with me on the marble steps. He looked older than I remembered. "Mom, this is getting out of hand." I studied him for a long moment. "No," I said. "It is getting documented." He looked as if he might say something honest at last, but Vanessa called from the curb, and he turned toward her instead. Loyalty reveals itself in where a man looks when truth appears. As I drove home, the Cadillac moved smooth as a promise, and for the first time, I sensed the case had begun tilting. Not because justice is automatic, because their reasons were starting to show. The hearing opened on a gray Thursday with sleet tapping the courthouse windows and everyone pretending weather was the day's only discomfort. I wore Arthur's old gold watch, though it had stopped years ago. Not for time. For steadiness. Margaret said judges notice people who carry themselves as though they belong in their own defense. Daniel sat at the opposite table beside Vanessa and Gregory Ames, all neutral colors and legal pads, arranged like competence itself. Yet when he looked at me, there was strain beneath the polish. He knew something had shifted since the pre-hearing conference. The judge began by asking simple questions. My age. My living arrangements. Whether I understood the nature of the proceedings. The questions phrased politely enough to resemble courtesy, though each one tested whether personhood could be reduced to responses on a record. I answered plainly. Then Daniel's counsel rose and spoke of impulsive spending, vulnerability to influence, concern for asset protection. The Cadillac returned again as symbol of recklessness. Strange what frightened them about a woman buying her own freedom. When Margaret stood, the room altered. Some people do not raise volume. They raise consequence. She dismantled the petition one assumption at a time. Medical records. Financial statements. Community affidavits. Then she introduced the documents tied to Daniel's firm distress and the exploratory home equity inquiries linked to his office. Gregory Ames objected. Too late. The judge asked whether petitioner wished to explain why collateral discussions involving respondent's home predated alleged competency concerns. Daniel's lawyer shuffled papers. Vanessa stared ahead, perfectly still. And then came the moment no one but Margaret and I knew was coming. She requested permission to enter a sworn declaration from a former administrative assistant at Daniel's firm, recently resigned, attesting she had been asked months earlier to research guardianship routes that could facilitate property liquidation, without resistance from family sentiment. The phrase landed like glass dropped in a quiet church. Daniel went pale. I did not look at him. I looked at the judge. Because truth gains force when witnessed by authority, not emotion. After a recess, the judge returned with a ruling from the bench. Petition denied. Temporary sanctions for bad faith filing imposed pending fee review. Inquiry opened regarding possible abuse of guardianship process. The words sounded almost clinical. Their effect was not. Daniel closed his eyes briefly as though absorbing physical impact. Vanessa whispered something sharp I could not hear. Gregory Ames packed his briefcase with the speed of a man distancing himself from smoke. Outside the courtroom, reporters were not waiting. This was not that kind of case, but in smaller towns humiliation travels by subtler vehicles. Clerks, lawyers, board members, donors, country club wives with excellent memory. By afternoon, 2 people had already called Margaret asking whether the rumor about Daniel seeking his mother's house as collateral was true. Reputation does not collapse in thunder. It leaks. Daniel caught me in the corridor before I reached the elevator. Who gave you that declaration? He demanded, voice low and frayed. For the first time, he sounded less offended than afraid. Someone who disliked being asked to turn ethics into paperwork, I said. He looked at me with something almost childlike then, as if trying to locate the mother who used to smooth consequences. But that woman had not disappeared. She had simply stopped shielding him from his own choices. You could have ruined me, he said. I held the elevator door. No, Daniel. Your petition tried to do that to itself. At home that evening, I found a message from the Regional Philanthropic Board, where Vanessa chaired fundraising. They requested, delicately phrased, clarification regarding concerns raised in public records. The unraveling had begun beyond court orders. Yet what unsettled me most came at dusk when Margaret called with one more discovery. During document review, they had found Daniel personally guaranteed more debt than we realized. If conservatorship had succeeded, my home might have stabilized those obligations. I sat in silence after the call, grief moving through me in slow, cold layers. Not because I had lost, because I now knew how close blood had come to becoming leverage. But grief no longer paralyzed. It sharpened resolve. Fee sanctions were only first reckoning. Margaret intended to pursue abuse findings. I stepped onto the porch where sleet had turned to thin snow and looked at the Cadillac under the porch light, dark and gleaming, almost improbable against winter. They had tried to use law as a cage. Instead, it had become a lantern. And for the first time, I sensed Daniel was beginning to understand the difference. The sanctions hearing on fees was scheduled 3 weeks later, but judgment had already begun outside the courtroom. In towns like ours, public records move faster than apologies. Daniel's firm removed his name from an expansion announcement. Vanessa resigned from the philanthropic board before they could vote her out. Even church whispers changed texture when people looked at me, no longer with pity, but with that curious respect reserved for someone who has survived something without performing victimhood. Yet consequences have a way of provoking desperation. And desperation arrived one rainy Tuesday when Daniel appeared at my door alone.
No, Vanessa.
No rehearsed concern. Just my son in a damp overcoat, looking older than 50. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table where so much had unraveled. For a long time he said nothing. Then, in a voice almost too low to hear, he admitted the commercial development losses were worse than I knew. Personal guarantees, margin calls, pressure from partners. He said he had believed using my home as temporary leverage would solve everything before I ever felt impact. I never meant to hurt you, he said. Strange sentence. People often mean the control and only regret the exposure. I asked whether Vanessa knew the full extent. He looked down. Some of it. I almost smiled at the honesty buried in omission. Then he asked whether I would consider helping him refinance privately, keep matters from becoming formal abuse findings. There it was. Even after losing in court, he still arrived negotiating through need. I folded my hands and told him something Arthur once told me when a cousin tried borrowing against our farm. Need does not create entitlement. Daniel's eyes shone with something close to shame. But before either of us could say more, the doorbell rang. Margaret. She had not planned theatrics, yet fate sometimes understands timing better than strategy. She entered carrying a folder thick enough to alter weather. New discovery responses had arrived. Gregory Ames, under pressure distancing himself, had produced emails. In one, Vanessa wrote that once the old house is under managed oversight, liquidity concerns could ease. My house reduced to mechanism. Margaret placed the printout before Daniel. He read it once, then again, face draining of whatever defense remained. She wrote this, he whispered. Using your firm account, Margaret said. Silence settled heavy as wool. I watched my son realize greed had not merely traveled through him. It had recruited him. He left soon after, shoulders bent in a way I had never seen. That night he called to say he had separated finances from Vanessa and disclosed the debt issues to his partners. 2 days later, abuse findings proceeded anyway. The judge ordered reimbursement of my legal costs and referred the matter for professional ethics review related to misuse of guardianship process. Financial consequence. Legal consequence. Public consequence. The triad greed never anticipates. But the true payoff came at the spring charity gala months later. I had not intended to attend until Father Nolan insisted. The ballroom shimmered with old money and floral centerpieces pretending generosity is simple. As I stepped from the Cadillac in a silver evening coat, conversation softened. People noticed. They always do when a woman others tried to sideline returns standing taller. Across the room, I saw Vanessa speaking to donors who no longer leaned in quite so warmly. Her smile flickered when she saw me. During the program, the foundation chair publicly thanked me for endowing a scholarship in Arthur's name with funds redirected through my restructured trust. Redirected. Such a graceful word for inheritance removed from grasping hands. Applause filled the room. I looked toward Daniel. He was there alone, seated near the back, not ruined, not exiled, but altered. That mattered more. Afterward he approached and quietly said he had read every trust provision. $1, he said with a rueful breath. You made your point. I looked at him a long moment. No, I said. I made a boundary. As I drove home after midnight, city lights trailing in the rearview mirror, I realized the story had ceased being about keys long ago. It had become about whether age could be mistaken for surrender. They had tried to move me off the board. Instead, I changed the game. And though I believed the reckoning nearly complete, Margaret called the next morning with one final surprise. A state investigator wanted my testimony, not because my case was over, because it might open others. The investigator met me in a federal building 40 miles south, a plain structure with fluorescent lights and no interest in drama, which somehow made what happened there feel more consequential. Her name was Elise Porter, silver-haired, direct, with the habit of listening as if omissions interested her more than statements. She said my case had triggered review of a pattern involving guardianship petitions used not for care, but leverage. I remember the word leverage catching in me again. How often greed borrows respectable language. I told her everything. The keys, Cedar Pines, the petition, the collateral inquiries, Vanessa's email, Daniel's debt. She took notes in long, deliberate strokes and only interrupted once to ask, when did you realize concern had become control? I answered without thinking. When they acted as though my consent was an obstacle. She nodded as if that belonged in a manual somewhere. Weeks passed. Spring deepened. Dogwoods bloomed along the church road. I returned to ordinary rhythms, committee meetings, grocery runs in the Cadillac, coffee with Margaret on Thursdays. Yet underneath, machinery moved. Subpoenas, ethics review, financial disclosures. Then one afternoon Daniel called, asking if he could come by. His voice was different now, stripped of argument. When he arrived, he carried no documents, no requests. Only a small wooden box. Inside were Arthur's old cufflinks Daniel had kept after the funeral. I should have given these back years ago, he said. We sat on the porch while evening light thinned across the yard. He admitted Vanessa had moved out. Separate counsel. Separate finances. He said the state inquiry had expanded beyond him and Gregory Ames had agreed to cooperate. Then he said something I had not expected to hear in this life. I let panic turn me into someone willing to justify using my own mother. No self-pity. Just fact. It landed harder because of that. I did not absolve him.
Some
Wounds heal without revisionist tenderness. But I believed remorse had finally entered the room. The real reckoning came a month later in an administrative hearing where findings were issued. Misuse of guardianship process substantiated. Daniel censured professionally and required to resign fiduciary oversight roles for a period. Gregory Ames sanctioned. Vanessa named in civil findings tied to attempted coercive influence over protected assets. Public record.
permanent. Clear.
I sat through the reading almost detached until I heard the chair conclude that respondent, meaning me, had demonstrated full autonomy wrongfully challenged. Such dry words to restore dignity. Outside reporters actually were waiting this time, local legal press mostly. Someone asked whether I felt vindicated. I said, I feel older institutions still occasionally recognize abuse when dressed in expensive clothing. Margaret nearly laughed out loud. But the most satisfying moment came later, back at my house, when a courier delivered certified confirmation that all legal fees had been reimbursed from parties sanctioned and a damages settlement for bad faith filing had been approved. I used part of that money to expand Arthur's scholarship fund. The rest paid cash for a small lakeside cottage I had quietly admired for years. Mine alone.
No debate. No permission.
When Daniel saw the closing papers, he looked stunned. You bought a second property? He asked. Yes, I said. Turns out financial impulsivity can be quite rewarding. For the first time in months, he laughed. A broken laugh, but real. In June, I drove the Cadillac to the lake cottage, 63 miles with windows down and old jazz playing low. The road curved through farmland Arthur loved. At the overlook, I pulled over and thought about how this began with a son pocketing car keys as if authority could be lifted from a hook. Instead, his scheme cost him money, reputation, legal standing, and nearly his marriage. The punishment had not been theatrical ruin. It had been exposure, far more durable. As for me, I had my home, my trust, my name, a new cottage, a scholarship bearing Arthur's memory, and the unmistakable pleasure of having converted attempted control into generational legacy. That might have been ending enough. But as I unlocked the cottage door for the first time, I found an envelope wedged inside the frame from Margaret. One line only. Check the county deed registry.
I did.
And what I found there made even me sit down. What I found in the county deed registry was not merely surprising. It was Arthur, reaching across death with one final lesson about foresight. 6 months before he died, he had recorded a dormant survivorship instrument tied to a land parcel adjoining the old lake cottage I had just purchased. 3 wooded acres with shoreline rights I never knew remained in his family line. Margaret had discovered it while tracing legacy holdings during the trust amendments and kept silent until now. I sat in the cottage kitchen staring at the deed copy, sunlight falling across pine floors, and laughed until tears came. Even in death, Arthur had managed one last calm move. When I called Daniel and told him, he was quiet, then said, almost with wonder, Dad always thought 5 steps ahead. He married someone who learned eventually, I said. The additional parcel changed the cottage from retreat into estate. Modest, but mine. Weeks later, I met a surveyor at the property, and while walking the shoreline, he mentioned casually that a developer had once approached neighboring owners years ago. The name of the development group chilled me. It was the same failed commercial venture tied to Daniel's partnership losses. Even though the circle closed, the very speculation that helped drive my son toward desperation now bordered land Arthur had quietly shielded from reach. Some ironies are too elegant to invent. Meanwhile, Daniel's consequences continued unfolding. The professional censure triggered review by clients. 2 accounts left his firm. He was not destroyed, but forced downward into humility. Vanessa attempted a quiet civil settlement to limit further reputational harm, but because findings were public, distance proved expensive. She sold the house she and Daniel once shared and moved to another county where, Margaret dryly observed, memory traveled more slowly.
1.
August afternoon, Daniel came to the lake cottage carrying blueprints. He had drawn, with the awkward earnestness of a man trying to repair through usefulness, a design for a small boathouse Arthur once dreamed about. We spread papers across the porch table. For the first time in years, our conversation held no hidden leverage. Just measurements. Cedar beams.
Doc permits.
At one point, he looked out over the water and said, "I still do not know how you stayed so calm when I took those keys." I considered answering with some grand principle, but truth was simpler. Because panic hands control to the wrong person. He nodded as though writing it somewhere inward. That autumn we broke ground on the boathouse. Paid from settlement funds awarded for bad faith filing.
There was poetry in that.
Their attempt to seize control financed a legacy structure on land they never knew existed. Yet the strongest reversal came not in property or law, but in status. At the annual church stewardship dinner, Father Nolan introduced me not as widow of Arthur Whitmore, as had been custom for years, but as founder of the Whitmore Independence Scholarship and advocate in elder rights reform consultations with the state. A room full of people rose to applaud. I saw Daniel standing among them, not as heir apparent, as witness. Afterward, a woman whispered she remembered when people murmured I might be losing my faculties. "Funny," she said, glancing toward the Cadillac in the lot. "You seem to have gained a second life instead." I smiled because she was right. And still one final legal piece remained. In November, the state issued advisory reforms citing cases, including mine, in tightening review standards for coercive guardianship petitions. My testimony had helped alter procedure. Think of that. A son takes his mother's keys and ends up helping trigger statewide safeguards against what he attempted. If justice has humor, it is often dry. On the first snow of December, Daniel drove me to the county office, where the adjoining parcel and cottage were formally consolidated into one protected estate under the revised trust. At signing, I amended one clause. Daniel would remain beneficiary of family keepsakes and limited legacy distributions, but direct control provisions would never return. Forgiveness is not the restoration of access. It is the refusal to keep bleeding. As we left, he held the door for me and said quietly, "You took back everything." I looked at the Cadillac waiting at the curb, black paint reflecting winter light, and answered, "No, Daniel. I kept what was already mine." That evening at the cottage, I found Arthur's old brass key ring in my coat pocket beside the Cadillac fob. Old key, new key, beginning and consequence. I set them together on the table and realized only one thing remained before the story could close: to decide what I wanted my final act to be, not as defense, but as declaration. Once the estate consolidation was complete, I thought perhaps the story had already delivered every lesson it meant to. I was wrong. Final acts, I have learned, are rarely about winning. They're about defining what victory means. Mine began with an invitation. I hosted Christmas dinner at my house for the first time since Arthur died. Not the lake cottage, the old family home where this began. I used the good china again, polished the silver, lit candles in the windows, and hung Arthur's brass sleigh bells by the door. Daniel arrived early to help carve the roast. There was a humility in him now that no lecture could have produced. Vanessa was not invited. Some distances are not punitive. They are structural. During dinner, after grandchildren had gone to the den and the fire settled into low orange coals, I stood and brought out a red leather folder. Everyone quieted. Daniel looked almost apprehensive. "I have one more matter to settle," I said. I handed him a copy of a new family charter Margaret and I had drafted, not legal exactly, but binding in the ways culture can be. It established the Whitmore Independence Fund, funded through my estate and settlement proceeds, supporting legal assistance for seniors facing coercive control. It also designated the lake property and boathouse as family heritage property, never to be mortgaged, leveraged, or sold for debt relief. Protected for future generations. Arthur would have approved. But there was one clause no one expected. Administration of the fund after my lifetime would be chaired by a 3-person board, including Daniel, but only under ethics provisions requiring unanimous approval for any action touching beneficiary assets. Power dispersed by design. Trust structured. Daniel read in silence, then looked up with wet eyes. "You still put me in it?" he asked. "I put you under safeguards," I said. The room laughed softly, even Daniel. But then I told him what mattered most. Redemption is not inherited. It is administered. Later, when guests had gone and only the tree lights glowed, Daniel lingered in the kitchen. He asked whether I had ever truly considered cutting him off entirely. I answered honestly. For 1 week, yes. He absorbed that. Then I added, but erasing a son teaches less than binding him to better conduct. He covered his face a moment and nodded. That spring the state invited me to speak at a symposium on elder autonomy law reform. Me, a woman once nearly declared incapable, speaking to judges and advocates. I wore a navy suit, drove the Cadillac myself, and opened with a line that made the room go still. Control often enters a family, wearing the face of concern. Afterwards, several women approached in tears, saying they had lived versions of what nearly happened to me. That day I understood my final act was larger than personal vindication. It was precedent. Yet the sharpest closure came unexpectedly months later when Daniel brought me a small velvet box. Inside was the old church charm that had once hung from my brass keys, reset into a pendant. For the woman who refused to be parked, he said, half smiling. It was such an awkward, earnest thing that I laughed until I nearly cried. I wore it the day the boathouse was finished. We stood on the dock at sunset, boards still smelling of cedar, lake water turning bronze. Daniel looked over the rail and said quietly, "When I took your keys, I thought I was assuming responsibility."
Y en suerte, no.
"You were testing whether I would abandon mine." He nodded slowly. Some confessions arrive too late to prevent damage, but not too late to complete understanding.
In the years that
followed, the scholarship grew. The fund helped families fight predatory petitions, and the story people repeated in town was no longer about a son who tried to control his mother. It was about the mother who changed the law and bought a Cadillac. That amused me. Legends often simplify what pain complicated. One October afternoon, exactly 3 years after Daniel pocketed those keys, I drove alone to Arthur's grave with chrysanthemums in the passenger seat. Same road, same 42 miles. But nothing in me was the same woman. I told him aloud what had happened. The sanctions, the trust, the boathouse, the fund, Daniel. Then I placed a hand on the stone and said, "You were right. 5 steps ahead matters." On the drive back, sunlight flashed across the hood, and I realized there was no loose end left to tie. The ones who tried to reduce me had paid in money, status, legal findings, and shame. I had gained property, legacy, authority, and a son chastened into honesty. That is not revenge. That is restoration with interest. And when I pulled into my driveway, I hung the brass keyring beside the Cadillac fob and understood my declaration had already been made long ago. The day I refused to ask for my keys back. The true ending came on a spring morning beneath the county courthouse flag when the state announced its final elder autonomy reforms and, to my astonishment, asked me to stand beside the Attorney General as one of the citizen advocates whose testimony had shaped them. Cameras flashed. Reporters took notes. The same legal culture once willing to entertain whether I was competent now introduced me by name as evidence that coercion inside families could wear respectable clothes. I wore a cream suit, Arthur's gold watch still stopped at the old hour, and the pendant made from my brass key charm resting at my collar. Daniel stood in the crowd near the back, not as heir, not as rescuer, but as a man made sober by consequences. And consequences had fully arrived. Gregory Ames had lost his consulting contracts after sanctions, and ethics findings followed him into every disclosure. Vanessa, after civil liability and reputational collapse, had been compelled through settlement to contribute to the Whitmore Independence Fund she once mocked in private emails. I did not request that clause. Margaret did. "Poetic remedies deter repetition," she said. She was right. Each year, a check arrived from a fund partly financed by the very people who tried to leverage my autonomy. Their greed now underwrote protections for women like me. There is a satisfaction almost too elegant for revenge in that. During the press conference, a reporter asked whether I blamed my son. I answered, "I blame the lie that age invites surrender." That quote ran in 2 regional papers. By evening, people I had not heard from in years called to congratulate me. But the greatest public unmasking came 3 months later at the Bar Association dinner, where misuse of guardianship statutes was being discussed as a cautionary chapter. A speaker referenced the Whitmore matter without naming it at first, then paused and said, "The respondent in that case is with us tonight." Hundreds turned. I stood. Applause rose. Not polite, but sustained. I looked across the room and saw former colleagues of Daniel's who once whispered about his disgrace, now standing too. Public humiliation had begun his punishment. Public acknowledgement completed the inversion. The mother once portrayed as vulnerable had become the authority in the room. Afterward, Daniel approached and said something I will never forget. "You did not just beat what I tried to do. You made it impossible for me to hide from what I became." I touched his arm and said, "Then something useful survived." Months later, we dedicated the boathouse. Family gathered on the dock. Grandchildren ran along cedar plank spot, as I liked to remind them, with sanctions money. We laughed every time. Before lunch, I called everyone close and made one final announcement. I was transferring the lake estate, the boathouse, and adjoining land into an irrevocable heritage trust effective immediately. No descendant could borrow against it, encumber it, or force sale. Ever. Protected beyond appetite. Then I handed Daniel a folder. He opened it and stared. "Co-trustee?" he asked. "With oversight," I said.
Permanent oversight.
The family
Laughed.
Daniel did too, though his eyes watered. It was not indulgence. It was the last proof I had taken back power so fully I could choose how to share fragments of it without risk. That is control restored. Years later, people still sometimes ask whether buying the Cadillac was my revenge. I always tell them no. The Cadillac was merely the moment I refused to accept the story others wrote for me. The real revenge, if one insists on the word, was this. The son who took my keys paid legal sanctions, lost status, saw his scheme exposed in public findings, and spent years rebuilding under the very safeguards his actions helped inspire. The daughter-in-law who treated my home as collateral-funded protections for the vulnerable through settlement and watched her social standing dissolve under facts she could not charm away. And I, the woman they tried to manage, kept my home, gained a lakeside estate, changed state procedure, endowed a lasting fund, restored my son through consequence instead of sentiment, and drove my own Cadillac wherever I pleased. One October, on the 5th anniversary of that Sunday dinner when Daniel pocketed my keys, I invited him for lunch. Afterward, I walked him to the pantry and pointed to the hook where the old brass keyring still hung beside the Cadillac fob. "Do you know why I keep both there?" I asked. He shook his head. "Because one reminds me what someone tried to take. The other reminds me what they accidentally gave back." He smiled in that quiet, broken way grief sometimes teaches. Before leaving, he said, "Mom, I thought taking your keys made me powerful." I answered, "No, Daniel. It made me dangerous." We both laughed, but I meant it. That evening, I drove alone to the ridge road above the lake, parked at the overlook, and watched sunset turn the water copper. The Cadillac engine clicked softly as it cooled. Wind moved through pine trees. Nothing unresolved remained. No hidden threat. No pending hearing.
No moral fog.
Only the clean, hard satisfaction of a life defended and enlarged. They had tried to reduce me to a problem to be managed. Instead, they financed my legacy, elevated my standing, and wrote themselves into a cautionary tale told in courtrooms. I started the engine, turned toward home, and as the headlights cut down the road, I thought of the first moment Daniel lifted those keys from the hook, believing he had taken command. If he had left them there, none of this would have happened.
No sanctions.
No exposure.
No scholarship. No reforms.
No lake estate. No legend people still repeat at church suppers about the widow who bought a Cadillac and outrove betrayal. That, to me, is perfect justice. Because in the end, I did not get my old life back. I drove beyond it.